Welcome to Tales by Tochi. These stories are real, unique and exceptional because they are from personal experiences around the African culture. Don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me, and also you will be able to enjoy and learn from these amazing stories. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun had barely risen in Amukwa village when Chuka knelt beside the bed he shared with Doris and offered his usual morning prayers. His palms were calloused from endless hours at his workshop, and his tattered singlet bore oil stains like permanent tattoos. Yet in his eyes there was a fire, one fueled by love, hope and unshakable faith in tomorrow. His wife, Doris, stirred beside him and groaned tiredly, pretending not to hear his words. She'd grown distant lately, colder than she was when they first married. Her heart had changed, not all at once but steadily, like a dripping tap eroding the base of a strong pillar. And Chuka, blinded by affection, refused to see it. When he rose to prepare her breakfast, her sharp voice sliced the air like a dagger. "Don't bother, Chuka. I'm not hungry." It stung, but he nodded, wearing the smile of a man trying too hard to keep something already slipping through his fingers. Mama Doris arrived later that day, uninvited as always, strutting into their small room like a queen visiting the slums. Her gold scarf shimmered under the sunlight, and her long lashes fluttered as if mocking the dusty air around her. "So this is the life you've chosen, Doris? This cage with bare cement floors and no future?" she hissed, glaring at Chuka with eyes full of disdain. "Mama, please," Doris murmured, shifting awkwardly on the only couch they had. Chuka greeted her respectfully, bowing slightly. "Welcome, Ma." But Mama Doris didn't respond. She made a show of scanning the room, her nose wrinkling as if she'd stepped in dirt. A man who can't even fix his own leaking roof wants to be called husband? Nonsense. The words pierced deeper than any physical blow, but Chuka remained calm. He knew this war wasn't new, it had been raging since the day he dared to ask for Doris's hand. The worst part wasn't Mama Doris's open disrespect, it was Doris's silence, her quiet consent to every insult. Each time her mother called Chuka useless, Doris never objected. Each time her mother hinted she deserved a man with class, not grease-stained palms, Doris only looked away. That night, after Mama Doris finally left in a storm of curses and slamming doors, Chuka turned to his wife and asked, "Do you believe all those things she said?" Doris avoided his eyes. "She only wants what's best for me." Chuka swallowed hard, pain rising in his throat like bile. "And what about what's best for us?" he asked. No answer came. Just silence. In that moment, Chuka realized he wasn't only fighting poverty, he was fighting for a love that was no longer his. Mama Doris wasn't one to rest after planting a seed of doubt. The very next morning she returned with a cunning smile and a mysterious black handbag. "You need to protect yourself, my daughter," she whispered into Doris's ear, after Chuka had gone to his workshop. She pulled out a packet of birth control pills and placed them on the table as though they were gold coins. "You must not get pregnant for that man," she added sternly. "You hear me? A child will only tie you to his poverty. Use these." Doris stared at the packet, confused but obedient. Mama Doris saw her hesitation and narrowed her eyes. "You think love will feed you? Let me tell you something, Doris, poverty kills love faster than death." That night, while Chuka talked about saving money to rent a better apartment, Doris secretly took the first pill. Weeks turned into months and Chuka grew more confused. He couldn't understand why Doris kept avoiding intimacy. "I'm tired," she would say, or, "Not tonight, I'm not in the mood." But the mood never came. She flinched at his touch and avoided his kisses. Chuka began to wonder if he had done something wrong. He bought her gifts, cooked for her on weekends, even cleaned the house, desperate to win back her affection. But nothing worked. He didn't know that the woman he loved was already walking away from him, one pill at a time. Mama Doris, meanwhile, kept feeding Doris tales of wealthy suitors and luxurious lives. "There's a man I know," she said slyly. "His name is Desmond. He owns properties in 3 states. He asked of you." Doris blinked in surprise, but her heart fluttered. Not because she was interested, at least not yet, but because she wondered what life with a man like that would feel like. One evening, as Chuka massaged her tired feet and spoke softly about children, Doris snapped. "Why must you always talk about kids? Can't you see we're barely surviving?" Chuka looked at her, stunned. "But I thought we wanted to build a family." She scoffed. "What family? In this shoebox? With what money, Chuka? Dreams?" The words hit like thunder. Chuka stood up slowly, pain visible in every muscle of his body. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply went into the corner of the room, sat on the floor and wept. He had no idea that Doris was already halfway gone, and the betrayal wasn't just hers, it was orchestrated, calculated, and backed by the one person who should have protected their union. The days that followed were filled with invisible wars. Chuka woke each morning hoping things would get better. He tried laughter, gifts, and even surprise outings to rekindle what they once had. But Doris had emotionally clocked out. Every touch felt like a burden to her. She rolled her eyes at his jokes, hissed at his affection, and made excuses to stay away from home. Chuka began to doubt his worth, not just as a husband but as a man. He avoided his friends, ignored his own birthday, and buried himself in work. His spirit dimmed. Even the tools in his workshop seemed heavier in his hands. But he kept pushing, because love to him wasn't a feeling, it was a commitment. Unfortunately, he didn't realize he was the only one still fighting. Doris started seeing Desmond secretly, meeting him in expensive restaurants and hotels. He dazzled her with charm, fragrance, and the illusion of luxury. He never raised his voice, never criticized her hair or clothes. He spoke of travel, wealth, and opportunities. Compared to Chuka's constant struggle, Desmond felt like an escape. But she didn't tell Desmond she was still married, not yet. Mama Doris encouraged the affair, saying, "Just get pregnant for him and watch how fast he'll marry you. That poor boy you married? He's a nobody." The words hardened Doris's heart even further. Each time Chuka tried to initiate closeness, she saw him through her mother's eyes, as a failure, not a husband. But deep within, Doris wasn't as happy as she pretended to be. Every night she lay beside Chuka and heard him whisper prayers for their future. Guilt scratched at her soul. She'd remember how he once walked miles just to deliver food to her when she was sick, how he sold his only generator to pay her school fees, how he fasted for days when she miscarried the first time. But those memories were now locked away behind the bars of her mother's greed and her own growing selfishness. Chuka noticed the quietness. He noticed how she no longer said, "I love you," how her smile never reached her eyes anymore. But he held on, thinking love was enough. He didn't know that a storm was coming, one that would shatter everything he had ever hoped for. It was on a Saturday evening when Doris finally met Desmond in person. Mama Doris orchestrated the meeting at a high-end lounge in town, where chandeliers sparkled like stars and classical music whispered through the air. Doris wore a borrowed dress and heels that pinched her feet, but the pain was drowned by the intoxicating scent of wealth that surrounded Desmond. He wore a tailored white suit, gold rings, and cologne that lingered in the air long after he passed. His words were polished, smooth like honey, and he never stopped smiling. "You deserve better," he told her after only 30 minutes of conversation. "A queen shouldn't be stuck in a cage." Doris blushed, unsure whether it was guilt or excitement that warmed her cheeks. When Desmond offered to drop her home in his sleek black SUV, she didn't hesitate. She forgot for a moment that Chuka existed. That night, Desmond kissed her hand and promised to show her what life really meant. At home, Chuka waited patiently with a pot of bitter leaf soup he'd spent hours preparing. He'd sold a spare car battery just to buy goat meat and her favorite soft drinks. The candles flickered as he reheated the food, checking the door every few minutes like a hopeful child on Christmas Eve. When Doris finally walked in hours later than expected, she waved off his excitement with a cold shrug. "I already ate," she said, heading straight to the bathroom. Chuka's heart sank. "But I cooked your favorite," he whispered, more to himself than to her. As she slammed the bathroom door, he sat at the table, staring at the untouched food, his appetite vanishing with every beat of his wounded heart. Outside the night grew darker. Inside so did his hope. He didn't know that he had already been replaced in his wife's heart, that another man now whispered lies into her ears, dressed in riches and promises. Mama Doris visited again the next day, full of praise for Desmond. "He said you're the most beautiful woman he's ever seen," she gushed, handing Doris an envelope filled with money from Desmond. "This is what a man should do, provide. That mechanic you married? He's not your destiny. Desmond is." Doris counted the money with trembling hands. It was more than Chuka earned in 2 months. Her conscience protested faintly, but Mama Doris's voice drowned it out. "Do you want to suffer forever? Think about your future, your children. Do you want them born into lack?" And so, the final string that tethered her to her marriage snapped. That night, while Chuka lay beside her, murmuring his usual bedtime prayers, Doris stared at the ceiling and made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The rain came down hard on the day Doris left, as though the heavens themselves were weeping. She waited until Chuka had gone to work before packing her few clothes and valuables into a small suitcase. Her heart beat faster with every item she folded, not because of fear, but because somewhere deep inside, a small voice still screamed that she was making a mistake. But Mama Doris stood at the door, ushering her to hurry, glancing at her wristwatch every few seconds. "Desmond is waiting," she said sternly. "This is your new life, Doris. Don't mess it up." When the car pulled up in front of their compound, neighbors watched in confusion. "Where is she going?" one asked. "Is that not Desmond, the big businessman?" another whispered. But no one dared to stop her. With her mother dragging the suitcase behind her and Desmond holding the car door open, Doris stepped out of Chuka's life like a thief in the night, stealing not just her body, but the dreams he had built around her. Chuka returned that evening with a bottle of malt and bread, humming to himself. He had just finished installing a new engine and earned enough to buy something small for Doris. He walked into the room and froze. It was empty. Her clothes, shoes, perfumes, gone. On the bed lay a note written in hurried handwriting. "I'm sorry. This marriage isn't working. I need more than love to survive." For a few seconds Chuka didn't move. He just stood there staring at the note, his mind refusing to process it. When it finally sank in, he dropped everything in his hands. The malt shattered and the bread rolled across the floor. "No," he whispered, sinking to his knees. The tears came in torrents, mixing with the rain leaking from the cracked ceiling. He had fought so hard. He had loved so deeply. But still he wasn't enough. For days Chuka wandered the streets like a ghost. He didn't go to the workshop. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. His friends came to check on him, but he only sat there, staring into space like a man whose soul had been stolen. Even the landlord grew concerned. "Nah, you need to eat." "Life goes on," he said, placing a plate of rice by his side. But Chuka didn't touch it. Every sound reminded him of her laughter, every corner of the room reminded him of her touch. He kept asking himself what he did wrong. Was it his poverty? His simplicity? Or his foolish hope that love was enough to conquer all? Little did he know the story wasn't over. Sometimes, a broken heart is only the beginning of a greater rise. The first light of healing came in the form of a woman named Adiz, a food vendor at the junction near Chuka's workshop. She had always admired his humility and quiet strength, though he never noticed. On a particular afternoon, as Chuka dragged himself past her kiosk with sunken eyes and sagging shoulders, she called out to him. "Oga Chuka, you never come to eat again. What'n happen?" He shook his head and tried to walk past, but his legs failed him. Adiz rushed forward and helped him sit under her umbrella. "You never chop today, ABI? Wait, make I bring you rice and beans," she said, not waiting for a response. Chuka tried to protest, but she waved him off. "Nah, who go die for love go write book," she joked gently. Something about her tone, unbothered yet caring, softened his chest. For the first time in days he allowed a spoonful of food into his mouth. Adiz didn't stop there. She sent food to his house, checked on him after market hours, and reminded him to take life one day at a time. "You still get breath. That one means say God never done with you," she told him one day. Chuka found solace in her presence. She didn't pity him. She didn't judge him. She just existed beside him, like a soft cloth placed over an open wound. Over time he began to talk, about his dreams, his heartbreak, his confusion. And she listened, offering only warmth and encouragement. "Your hands fit build empire," she'd say, tapping his fingers. "No, let one woman write the end of your story." Slowly the clouds in Chuka's heart began to clear. He returned to the workshop, this time with renewed focus. Pain had become fuel. Betrayal had become fire. It was Adiz who handed him the seed of hope, her savings from 3 years of hawking. "Use him start better workshop," she said one morning, placing a brown envelope in his hands. Chuka was stunned. "Why would you give me this?" he asked. Her eyes glistened. "Because I believe in you. And because one day I know you'll rise." Chuka stared at her, and something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Not pity, not guilt, but something dangerously close to love. Not the passionate whirlwind he once knew, but the calm assurance that maybe, just maybe, someone could love him for who he truly was. The road ahead was still long, but with Adiz by his side, the journey no longer felt impossible. Doris's wedding to Desmond was everything her first could never be, grand, loud, and soaked in opulence. The church was filled with roses, crystal chandeliers dangled from hired tents, and guests arrived in fleets of luxury cars. Photographers circled like hawks, capturing the bride's every step. Doris wore a beaded gown imported from Dubai, and her fingers sparkled with jewelry Desmond had bought her in just 1 week. Mama Doris danced like a woman possessed, spraying Naira notes while chanting, "My daughter Don Hammer." The crowd cheered, blind to the undercurrent of tension that flowed through Doris's smile. She should have been overjoyed, but something in her heart ached with every step she took down the aisle. It wasn't just the memory of Chuka, it was the uncomfortable realization that everything felt like a show she couldn't exit. Chuka heard of the wedding from neighbors and friends. He didn't attend. He couldn't. Instead, he stayed in his workshop, drenched in sweat and motor oil, his hands fixing a customer's car while his heart wrenched in silence. But something was different now. The pain didn't paralyze him anymore, it pushed him forward. Every clang of a spanner, every whir of an engine became therapy. Adiz brought him food that day as she often did. She didn't say a word about the wedding. She only smiled and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "She chose what she thought was gold," Adiz whispered. "But gold can burn too." Chuka nodded, holding back tears. There was no anger in him, just resolve. If life had stripped him bare, then he would rise from the ashes in a garment of his own making. Meanwhile, Doris began her new life in Desmond's mansion. The house was massive, furnished with expensive art and automated systems that obeyed voice commands. There were servants, chefs, drivers, and even a personal stylist. For the first few weeks, it felt like a fairy tale. Desmond was attentive, charming, and generous. But slowly his true nature emerged, like mold beneath a painted wall. He criticized her choices, mocked her background, and rolled his eyes whenever she mentioned her dreams. He became possessive, demanding her every movement and controlling who she could speak to. Doris shrugged it off at first, assuming it was just adjustment. But one night, when she returned home slightly late from a spa visit, Desmond slapped her across the face. No warning. No explanation. Just pain. As she lay on the floor, shocked and bleeding from the lip, she realized that the price of gold might be higher than she was ever prepared to pay. Doris looked in the mirror the morning after the slap, staring at her swollen lip and bloodshot eyes. The housemaid, blessing, silently handed her ice in a cloth, saying nothing. The silence was thick, filled with unspoken understanding. Doris touched her face gently, more from disbelief than pain. "He didn't mean it," she whispered, as if trying to convince herself. But deep down, a pit had formed in her stomach. Mama Doris visited that afternoon, eager to show off new pictures from the wedding. She laughed heartily, sipping wine by the pool until she noticed the bruises. "What happened to your face?" she asked, frowning. Doris hesitated, then lied. "I fell in the bathroom." Mama Doris stared for a moment before waving it off. "Be careful next time. But at least you're in a real house now. Endure it. Marriage no be beans." Doris felt the weight of her mother's expectations crush any voice that wanted to scream for help. Desmond's temper worsened with each passing week. His love came in waves, lavish gifts after violent episodes. After the first slap came a designer bag. After the second, a trip to Dubai. It became a vicious cycle of abuse and compensation. Doris stopped trying to speak her mind, afraid that any disagreement would bring another storm. She wore long sleeves to cover the bruises, smiled for Instagram pictures, and posed beside her husband at public events. But at night, she cried into silk pillows, wishing for the cramped room she once called home, where love had been genuine even if money had been absent. Every corner of Desmond's mansion echoed with loneliness. She had married a provider, yes, but not a partner. She was caged in a golden prison, and each glittering bar reminded her of the life she had thrown away. Meanwhile, Chuka was thriving, quietly. With Adiz's support, he had expanded his workshop, bought better tools, and even hired 2 apprentices. Customers loved his humility and attention to detail. A businessman named Mr. Adebayo noticed his work and offered to invest in expanding the workshop into a car service center. Chuka couldn't believe the transformation. He no longer walked with his head down. He no longer lived in that leaking room. He had moved into a modest 2-bedroom flat and bought a used car, his first. When Adiz saw it, she clapped and hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe. "I told you," she whispered. "I knew you were meant for more." Chuka looked at her, seeing not just the woman who fed him, but the one who believed when no one else did. It was no longer just gratitude, it was love. Under the fading evening sky, Chuka took Adiz to the beach for the first time in her life. She wore a simple dress and flat sandals, yet her beauty outshone the sunset. They sat on a quiet part of the sand, their bare feet sinking gently into the earth as waves lapped nearby. "This is the first time in years I feel at peace," Chuka admitted, his eyes scanning the horizon. Adiz smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You've been through fire," she said, but now you're gold refined. Chuka chuckled softly. Funny. Someone once left me because I wasn't gold enough. Adiz looked at him, her expression tender. Then thank God she did. Her exit made room for someone who would see your worth without the shine. There were no grand declarations that night, no promises shouted into the wind, just two wounded souls finding healing in each other's quiet presence. Weeks passed and Chuka's business continued to grow. His name began to spread beyond the town, and soon he was invited to speak at a small entrepreneurship seminar. Adiz sat proudly in the front row, clapping the loudest as he spoke about humility, persistence, and faith. After the event, he took her out for a quiet dinner at a small restaurant they used to pass on their evening walks. There, surrounded by soft music and warm light, Chuka went down on one knee and held out a small ring. You were my light in darkness, my roof in the storm. Will you build the rest of life with me? He asked. Tears streamed down Adiz's cheeks as she nodded. Yes, Chuka. 1,000 times yes. The other diners clapped softly, some wiping their eyes. It wasn't just a proposal, it was a full-circle moment of grace after pain. News of Chuka's engagement spread fast, eventually reaching Mama Doris through mutual acquaintances. She was shocked. That boy? Chuka the mechanic? Rich? She asked, almost choking on her cola nut. When she confirmed the story, she laughed bitterly. Let's see how long it lasts. But deep inside, fear began to fester. She knew her daughter had made a mistake. Doris, on the other hand, scrolled through her phone in silence that evening, staring at a photo someone had sent her. Chuka kneeling before Adiz, joy radiating from his face. Doris zoomed in on his smile, her own lips trembling. For the first time she realized what she had lost. Not just a man but a future, one built on love, not wealth. As she turned to look at the bruises still healing on her back, the walls of her golden mansion felt colder than ever. The tension in Desmond's mansion had grown so thick, Doris could almost hear it in the walls. What once felt like a palace now reeked of fear. Each footstep echoed like a warning. Every evening, she waited with trembling hands, unsure of what mood Desmond would come home in. His outbursts became unpredictable, sometimes over a misplaced remote control, other times over food that wasn't hot enough. The staff had learned to avoid eye contact with him, and even Blessing, the loyal housemaid, walked on eggshells. Doris kept her face made up and her clothes pristine, but beneath the glamour lay bruises, some fresh, others healed. She grew used to applying foundation on her jawline before stepping out. She wore sunglasses more often, not because of the sun, but to hide the swelling around her eyes. Still she said nothing. She'd been taught to endure. Her mother's voice constantly echoed in her mind, marriage no be beans. Mama Doris was no longer as cheerful as before. The signs of abuse were becoming difficult to ignore. Each time she visited, she noticed something new, a limp, a bruise, a wince, but Doris always had a rehearsed excuse. I fell in the bathroom. I bumped into the cupboard. I was clumsy. But one day when she saw a deep cut across Doris's collarbone, she paused. Desmond did this, didn't he? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Doris didn't answer. Instead, she looked away, blinking back tears. Mama Doris sat down slowly, her voice trembling. I told you to endure. I didn't know it would come to this. For the first time, the proud woman who had pushed her daughter into luxury looked defeated. But pride kept her from admitting fault. Just hold on. You will change. Men always do when they see their wives remain loyal, she said, but even she didn't believe it anymore. Meanwhile, Doris was slowly slipping into a shell. She stopped calling friends, stopped posting on social media, and stopped attending social events. Her laughter became hollow, her eyes lifeless. Desmond had turned into a demon she couldn't predict or pacify. And though she had walked into the mansion in search of wealth, she now found herself imprisoned by it. The expensive curtains, the imported chandeliers, the gleaming floors, they all mocked her daily. In the solitude of her bathroom, she'd look into the mirror and whisper, God help me. But heaven remained silent. Desmond, oblivious to the damage he was causing, continued his life as usual, drinking at nightclubs, entertaining mistresses, and returning home to unleash his rage on the woman who had once believed he was her savior. The once glamorous Doris now lived in a golden cage, one that no longer even had a key. Chuka's workshop was buzzing with activity. What once stood as a humble open shed had evolved into a structured facility, painted walls, organized bays, and staff in matching overalls with Chuka Auto Services embroidered across the back. His reputation had soared beyond the community. Clients came from as far as Enugu and Owerri to have their cars serviced. Chuka now employed 5 mechanics, and Adiz helped with administrative work. She created invoices, managed bookings, and handled customer service like a pro. Every day as he watched her work, Chuka was reminded that true beauty wasn't in makeup or jewelry, it was in loyalty, in sacrifice, in the smile of someone who stayed when there was nothing to stay for. Adiz became more than just his fiancée, she became the heartbeat of his empire. One Sunday afternoon, they attended a Thanksgiving service in church. Chuka had donated funds to repair the church's leaking roof and had quietly paid school fees for 3 orphans in the congregation. The pastor invited him up to share his testimony, and as he stood before the altar, tears filled his eyes. "I was once a broken man," he said, "betrayed, abandoned, and mocked. But God sent me an angel in the form of a woman who saw greatness in a mechanic. Today we build not just a business but a future together." The congregation applauded, and Adiz, seated in the front pew, wiped her tears. Later that day, Chuka surprised her with land documents, a piece of property he had bought in her name. "For everything you've done, this is just a small thank you," he said. Adiz broke down, hugging him tightly. "I never asked for anything," she whispered. "But God gave me everything through you." Their engagement ceremony was small but beautiful. Friends, family, and community members gathered to celebrate a love born in adversity. There were no flashy cars or celebrity guests, but there was joy, pure, unfiltered joy. Chuka's mother, who had once been skeptical of Adiz, publicly apologized for ever doubting her. "You brought my son back to life," she said, embracing her. During the toast, Chuka raised his glass and said, "I was once a man everyone counted out. But this woman counted me in. Today we rise together." The guests clapped, and the music resumed, but somewhere in the crowd, a familiar face watched from a distance. Mama Doris. She hadn't been invited, but curiosity drove her to attend secretly. As she watched Chuka celebrate with Adiz, her heart filled with a cocktail of regret, shame, and disbelief. Her daughter had married a man with money. But Chuka had become a man with everything. The transformation of Chuka's life was no longer a secret. His story began to appear in local newspapers and business blogs. From mechanic to mogul, the rise of Chuka Auto Services. He was invited to speak at universities, banks, and youth conferences, where young men saw in him the symbol of resilience. Adiz was always beside him, managing logistics and sometimes speaking on behalf of women who support men's dreams. Together they started an apprenticeship program for boys on the streets, offering them training, meals, and monthly stipends. What began as survival had grown into legacy. Chuka, now dressed in custom-made suits, drove a sleek Lexus and moved into a duplex, but his humility remained intact. He still stopped to greet old customers, still visited the elderly mechanic who taught him as a boy, and still held Adiz's hand in public like she was the most precious jewel he owned. But amid the celebrations, Chuka never forgot where he came from, or who he used to be. Late at night, he often sat on his balcony, remembering the tiny room he once shared with Doris, the tears he shed alone, the nights he prayed for change. Adiz once found him lost in thought and sat beside him. "You're thinking about her again?" she asked softly. Chuka nodded. "Not because I want her back, but because I needed to be broken to see who I truly was." Adiz rested her head on his shoulder. "God breaks us not to destroy us, but to rebuild us." In that moment, Chuka knew he had everything he could ever want. Not just wealth but peace. Not just love but purpose. The wound had become a scar, and scars, though ugly, are proof that healing happened. Meanwhile, word of Chuka's success reached Desmond's ears, but he dismissed it. "A mechanic? Please," he scoffed. But Doris didn't scoff. She had seen the videos, watched the interviews, seen the pictures of his smiling face beside Adiz. She noticed how happy he looked, how fulfilled. The bruises on her own body throbbed as if to remind her of the choices she made. Regret, once a whisper, had now become a scream in her chest. She no longer envied gold, she longed for the comfort of iron, for the honest love of a man who once prayed for her daily. One night, while Desmond snored beside her, she crept into the bathroom and wept. Not just for her pain but for what could have been. As she looked at her reflection, tired eyes, faded smile, she whispered the truth she had buried for too long: "I made the biggest mistake of my life." Desmond's empire began to crack from within, slowly at first, then all at once. His business partners started backing out of deals due to his erratic behavior, and reports of domestic abuse leaked into professional circles. Though powerful and rich, Desmond had enemies, people who envied his rise and were waiting for his fall. The whispers turned into online stories, and before long, a scandal erupted on social media. Screenshots of Doris's bruises, voice recordings of his verbal assaults, and even a leaked hospital report surfaced. In the past, his wealth could bury such news, but now the weight of his reputation was heavier than money could carry. He dismissed the stories as fabricated lies, blaming jealous ex-employees and haters, but deep down he knew he had lost control. For the first time, his mansion felt like a fortress under siege, and he could sense it slipping through his fingers. Doris, on the other hand, was too exhausted to care about Desmond's tarnished image. She had reached a point where nothing surprised her anymore. The abuse continued even after the scandal, but this time Desmond added guilt to his arsenal. "You ruined me," he spat one night after throwing a whiskey glass against the wall. "You've cursed my life." She no longer reacted to his blows. She simply endured them in silence, detached from her own pain. She had learned the art of emotional withdrawal. Every slap felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. The woman who once smiled with excitement as she entered this mansion now walked its halls like a shadow, her soul buried beneath the tiles. Blessing, the housemaid, wept in secret each time she cleaned Doris's blood from the floor. "Madam, run. Please," she whispered one night. But Doris only shook her head. To where? Back at her mother's house, Mama Doris sat in stunned silence as neighbors gossiped openly about Desmond's abuse. She had become the symbol of greedy parenting gone wrong. Women in the community who once admired her now mocked her. "See where big man Peking marriage end?" they'd say. "Her daughter no fit even get peace inside mansion." Mama Doris stopped attending social functions. She stayed indoors, battling the same regret that had begun to eat her daughter alive. She had pushed Doris to reject love, to chase riches, to abandon a man who would have cherished her forever. And now, she watched helplessly as that same man became a symbol of success and happiness with another woman. Mama Doris wanted to blame fate, but deep inside she knew the life her daughter now endured was a direct consequence of her own hands. Doris sat quietly one afternoon, scrolling through a social media video of Chuka donating scholarships to underprivileged youths. He stood on a small stage beside Adiz, who was carrying their newborn baby, a beautiful boy with bright eyes and a soft smile. The crowd cheered as Chuka lifted the child and kissed his forehead. "This is my legacy," he said into the microphone. "This is why I work, why I strive, why I love." Doris watched in silence, her heart breaking with every second. She hadn't realized how deeply Chuka had moved on until that moment. He wasn't just doing well, he was thriving, fulfilled, and more in love than he had ever been with her. A sudden wave of desperation washed over her. She picked up her phone and dialed his old number. It rang and rang, until a voice she didn't recognize answered. "Hello, Chuka's PA speaking. How may I help you?" Caught off guard, Doris stuttered. It's Doris. Please, I want to speak with him." The woman on the other end paused, then responded firmly. "I'll deliver your message, but Mr. Chuka is currently unavailable. If this is personal, please forward your request to his office assistant." Doris ended the call in shame. Her hands trembled as she gripped the phone, and for a moment she considered going to his workshop in person. But something in her told her that the doors she had once slammed shut were now permanently locked. She remembered how Chuka had begged her to stay, how he had cried when she walked out on him, how he had suffered silently in her absence. And now, when she needed him most, she realized too late, she was no longer his priority. She wasn't even a memory he wanted to revisit. Chuka, on his end, had heard the message from his assistant. He didn't respond. He didn't even ask what Doris wanted. He simply whispered, "Let it go," and continued feeding his son with Adiz laughing beside him. He bore no anger, no desire for revenge, only a deep sense of peace. He had fought the hardest battle a man could face, the betrayal of love, and had emerged victorious. Not with bitterness but with grace. That evening, as they sat together in their cozy living room, Adiz asked gently, "She called, didn't she?" Chuka nodded. Adiz didn't press. Instead, she leaned in and kissed his forehead. "You chose me and I'll choose you every day," she whispered. In that moment, Chuka closed his eyes, offering a silent prayer, not for himself but for Doris. Not that she would come back, but that she would one day find healing, even if it was without him. Mama Doris became a shadow of her former self. The once boastful woman who mocked poor suitors and worshipped wealth now sat alone in her front yard, plucking dry weeds from the ground while replaying every decision she had made. Her compound, once lively with gossip and visitors, had become eerily silent. Even her fellow women no longer stopped by. The shame had spread like wildfire. Her daughter's abuse was no longer rumor, it was fact. And everyone knew she had played a key role in pushing Doris into that marriage. Regret wrapped around her neck like a tightening rope. Each cough, each groan reminded her of the burden she carried. But worse than her own pain was watching her daughter's spirit wither daily. Doris, who used to shine like the morning sun, now avoided mirrors altogether. She no longer dressed up. She barely spoke. And Mama Doris could do nothing but weep silently behind closed doors. One evening, as the sky darkened and the electricity blinked out again, Mama Doris lit a candle and called Doris to sit with her. "My daughter," she began, her voice shaky, "I failed you." Doris blinked, staring into the flame. "You told me to leave a man who loved me and enter a house where I was never safe." The words weren't said with anger, they were said with defeat. Mama Doris trembled. "I thought I was protecting you. I didn't want you to suffer like I did." Doris turned slowly. "You made me suffer worse." That statement broke something inside the old woman. She wept, falling to her knees. "Forgive me," she cried. "If I could undo everything, I would. I should have let you build with Chuka. I should have let you choose love." Doris stood up and walked away, not out of spite, but because some wounds don't heal just because apologies are spoken. That night, Mama Doris lay awake on her mat, staring at the cracked ceiling. She remembered the day Chuka came to ask for Doris's hand in marriage. She had mocked his clothes, insulted his dreams, and accused him of wanting to trap her daughter in poverty. Now that same man had risen not just in wealth but in honor. And her daughter? She had been broken, beaten, and left with nothing but memories of what could have been. Mama Doris realized that the real poverty wasn't in Chuka's pocket back then, it was in her mindset, in her arrogance. She had valued appearance over substance, money over character, and now her family was paying the price. As tears soaked her pillow, she whispered into the darkness, "May God give my daughter another chance at peace, even if I never find mine." Adiz stood in the heart of the new auto complex Chuka had just opened in Lagos, overseeing final arrangements for the launch. Her eyes sparkled with quiet pride as she instructed the decorators, settled payments, and handled unexpected hiccups with grace. She had grown into her role seamlessly, not just as Chuka's wife, but as his business partner, friend, and co-builder. The journey hadn't been easy. She remembered the nights she sat beside Chuka in the old workshop, calculating profits with a lantern and sweating over handwritten receipts. Back then all they had were dreams and each other. Now they had over 30 employees, partnerships with top companies, and a reputation that was spreading nationally. Yet Adiz remained grounded. She still smiled at everyone, still cooked for her husband when she could, and still told people proudly, "We started with nothing." On launch day the auto complex buzzed with energy. Journalists, business leaders, celebrities, and even government officials attended. A ribbon stretched across the compound entrance, flanked by banners bearing Chuka's face and logo. Adiz wore a fitted Ankara gown, her hair braided neatly, and carried their infant son in her arms as she stood beside her husband. When the ribbon was finally cut and the applause erupted, Chuka turned to her and kissed her forehead. "This is your victory too," he whispered. "You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Adiz smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. Later, during his speech, Chuka introduced her not just as his wife, but as the vision behind the vision. He told the crowd how she fed him when he was broken, invested her last savings, and gave him hope when everything else failed. The guests stood and applauded, many moved to tears. After the event, as they sat alone on the terrace of their home, Chuka watched Adiz cradling their baby and whispered, "You're my answered prayer." She turned and smiled. "And you're my miracle." They shared a quiet moment, no words, just gratitude. The pain of the past had made their present even more beautiful. Chuka didn't speak of Doris anymore. He had closed that chapter with dignity. His healing wasn't loud, it was complete. And Adiz never tried to compete with the ghost of a woman he once loved. She simply loved him so well, so fully that there was no room left for what once was. Together they planned the future, expanding the business, building a second home in Enugu, and creating a foundation for women who supported struggling men. Adiz knew the world often celebrated men who rose, but she wanted to make sure women like her, the builders behind closed doors, were seen too. The days in Desmond's mansion turned darker. The scandal surrounding his abusive behavior had cost him 2 major business deals, and investors were pulling out. His anger, now fueled by professional failure, turned monstrous. Doris had become a punching bag, his outlet for frustration, his scapegoat for every misfortune. One evening, after a particularly violent outburst over a misplaced file, Desmond struck her with a bottle. She fell to the floor unconscious, blood pooling beneath her head. Blessing, the housemaid, screamed and rushed to her aid. She called an ambulance, ignoring Desmond's threats. "If she dies, not prison straight," she muttered under her breath, shaking with fear. Doris was rushed to the hospital and slipped into a coma. The doctors confirmed it was a traumatic brain injury, serious, but treatable if immediate steps were taken. As she lay lifeless in a hospital bed, Desmond was arrested for domestic violence and attempted murder. The news spread like wildfire. The media latched onto it, broadcasting every detail. Business mogul arrested for assaulting wife into coma. The same society that once praised Desmond now turned against him with fury. Activists called for justice, women's groups protested outside the police station, and sponsors withdrew all affiliations. Desmond's empire crumbled overnight. Mama Doris, upon hearing the news, collapsed in her parlor. Her neighbors helped revive her, but her spirit remained broken. "My daughter, my only child," she wailed. The same daughter she had pushed into luxury was now lying between life and death. She went to the hospital and saw Doris hooked up to machines, her face pale and unrecognizable. Guilt consumed her like a flame. She fell to her knees beside the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. "God, take me instead," she cried. "I built this hell for her." Back in Lagos, Chuka sat in his office reviewing expansion documents when a former neighbor called him. "Have you heard about Doris?" the man asked. "She's in a coma. Her husband nearly killed her." Chuka froze, his pen dropping from his hand. For a long time he said nothing. His heart didn't race. There was no anger. Just silence. He looked at Adiz across the office, holding their baby and smiling as she spoke to a client. He gently excused himself and stepped outside, taking a moment to breathe. That night, after tucking their son into bed, he told Adiz what he had heard. She placed her hand on his and simply said, "Do what your heart tells you." Chuka nodded. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but deep inside he knew that some actions aren't about the past, they're about the kind of man you choose to be in the present. The next morning, Chuka contacted his lawyer and arranged for an anonymous donation to the hospital treating Doris. He paid for her surgery, ICU bills, and even arranged for a private nurse. He made sure his name wouldn't appear anywhere, not on receipts, not in reports. This wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't a gesture of love either. It was a final act of closure. Chuka didn't visit the hospital. He didn't need to see her in that vulnerable state. His compassion wasn't tied to her returning to his life. It was simply an echo of the man he had always been, the man she had once discarded. For Chuka, helping Doris wasn't weakness, it was strength. It proved that despite what he had been through, he hadn't allowed bitterness to define him. As he signed the final paperwork for her medical support, he exhaled deeply, as though releasing the last ounce of pain she had caused him. When Mama Doris discovered that the bills had all been paid, she was stunned. "Who did this?" she asked the nurse. The woman shrugged. "An anonymous donor. But we were told to give you this." She handed her a small card with only 4 words written in fine cursive. "Forgiven, but not forgotten." Mama Doris knew instantly who it was. Tears filled her eyes as she stared at the message. The weight of her shame pressed harder against her chest. "He still helped her, after everything," she whispered. For the first time in decades, Mama Doris went to church, not to pray for riches or blessings, but to kneel before God and ask for true forgiveness. She cried through the entire service, confessing her sins to a God she had long abandoned in pursuit of wealth. The congregation didn't judge her. Some even embraced her. But she knew the true healing would only come when her daughter woke up. Weeks later, Doris slowly regained consciousness. The doctors celebrated it as a miracle. But when she opened her eyes, the world felt distant, cold and unfamiliar. She remembered everything, the beatings, the blood, the betrayal of a life she thought was a dream. Mama Doris was by her side, holding her hand and weeping. "I'm sorry, my daughter. I failed you," she whispered. Doris blinked slowly, unable to speak just yet. Her eyes searched the room, half expecting to see Chuka. But he never came. And somehow she knew he wouldn't. He had given her mercy, but not his heart. That belonged to someone else now. As she drifted in and out of sleep, Doris realized that waking up wasn't the hardest part. The real challenge would be living with everything she had lost, and everything she had learned. Doris returned to the mansion weeks after her discharge, but it no longer felt like home. The once glistening tiles seemed dull, the grand staircase cold, and the air heavy with memories of pain. Desmond was in prison awaiting trial, and the silence in the house was deafening. There were no staff to serve her. Blessing had resigned, and the others had vanished the moment the scandal broke. The media hounded her for interviews, wanting to turn her survival into a story, but she declined every offer. Her body had healed, but her soul remained bruised. She wandered the empty halls in silence, haunted by echoes of her past laughter and screams. Each room carried a different memory, some luxurious, others horrific. She once believed she was entering a life of beauty, but all she had gained was trauma cloaked in gold. Mama Doris moved in temporarily, insisting she wouldn't leave her daughter alone. But their conversations were filled with awkward silences and eyes that refused to meet. "We can sell this house," Mama Doris suggested one evening. "Start fresh, somewhere simple." But Doris said nothing. She knew the house was tainted. It was a monument to her mistake, a palace built on heartbreak. The furniture, the mirrors, the gold-framed photos, all reminders of the night she chose money over love. She stared at one photo in particular, her wedding day, smiling beside Desmond, her eyes gleaming with pride. She ripped it from the wall and smashed the glass. "I lied to myself," she murmured. "I called this a blessing. But it was a curse wrapped in ribbons." Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I had everything when I had nothing. Now I have nothing even with everything." One night, unable to sleep, Doris took a slow walk outside. The air was cool and the sky blanketed in stars. She passed the gate unnoticed and walked barefoot down the road. Her mind kept flashing back to Chuka, his kindness, his tears, his dreams. The way he once looked at her like she was his whole world. She closed her eyes and remembered how he used to pray for them each night, hands clasped, hope in his voice. A single tear slid down her cheek. She would never forget him. But she also knew she could never have him again. That door had closed. He was someone else's joy now, someone who deserved him. Doris wasn't angry. She was remorseful. And for the first time since her collapse, she whispered into the night, "Chuka, I'm sorry. I don't want you back. I just pray you stay happy." The one-year anniversary of Chuka Auto Foundation was marked with a large public event at a community center in Lagos. It wasn't flashy, but it was meaningful. Dozens of beneficiaries, boys who once roamed the streets and young women who had suffered from domestic violence, shared stories of how their lives had changed. Adiz stood tall beside her husband, their son clapping his small hands beside them. Chuka delivered a speech that brought tears to many eyes. "Wealth is not in what you have but in what you give. Success is not in fame but in how many people smile because you lived." The crowd rose in applause. And as he stepped down from the podium, Adiz whispered, "Your pain became their freedom." Chuka smiled. "And your love became my healing." That day they gave out 20 scholarships, 5 startup grants, and launched a new center for abused women. It was no longer about the past, it was about the future. Somewhere in the crowd, behind dark glasses and a scarf, Doris watched silently. She didn't come to cause a scene. She came to see what love looked like when it was nurtured. She stood beneath a tree, listening to the laughter, watching the way Chuka lifted their child and kissed Adiz's cheek in public. She didn't cry. She didn't interrupt. She only smiled, faintly, and whispered, "Thank you for becoming the man I always knew you could be." Then, with grace and quiet dignity, she turned and walked away. It wasn't a dramatic exit. There were no final words. Just a broken woman learning to rebuild. Her journey wouldn't be easy, but it would be honest. For once, she was no longer chasing riches. She was chasing peace. Back home, Chuka sat with Adiz on their balcony watching their son run across the lawn. The sunset painted the sky with strokes of gold and crimson. He reached for her hand and said, "I thought losing her was the end of my story. But it was only the beginning." Adiz leaned into him. "Sometimes God removes people from our lives not to punish us, but to protect us." He nodded, a peaceful smile on his face. In the background, their son laughed as he chased butterflies, unaware of the battles his parents had won. And as dusk settled, Chuka realized he had found the true riches he had always longed for. Not cars, not houses, not headlines, but love that healed, a legacy that mattered, and a peace that surpassed understanding. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel.